Welcome everyone for the third and the last day of Method and Convergence. Our first speaker is Ilkka Pättiniemi from University of Turku and Helsinki Circle. This presentation has been prepared by Ilmari Hirvonen from University of Helsinki, Petri Turunen, also from University of Helsinki, and Ilkka. And they have for some years had this society called the Helsinki Circle, where they contemplate important issues of philosophy of science. And now Ilkka will give this presentation, and Petri is there. He will comment, and everybody is naturally welcome to comment. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us here to give this presentation. Ilmari couldn't be here because he has pneumonia and he's watching the stream and cringing at how badly I do. So the subject for today is how philosophy can make useful progress. And let's do a bit of preliminaries here. So there have been a lot of criticism of philosophy, of the usefulness of philosophy. And let's start with external critics. So here's one piece of external criticism from Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinov in their book, The Grand Design. They state, philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Now, of course, anyone who read the book knows that it doesn't take them too long to defend something they call model-based realism. So it seems like they are still committing the sin of philosophy themselves. But that's probably a bit beside the point. Now they are not alone. There are a lot of other people who have, outside of philosophy, who have expressed extreme or milder skepticism towards the usefulness of philosophy, at least when it comes to science. But there are also internal critics, so let's start from pretty far away. René Descartes, in his discourse on method, criticized philosophy that had gone on before him. I shall not say anything about philosophy except that it has been cultivated by the best minds for centuries, and that nevertheless there is nothing in it that is not disputed and consequently is not subject to doubt. So he's bemoaning the lack of sort of progress that has been made. There are no lasting results, he thinks, thus far. So we see that this sort of critical attitude towards philosophy within philosophy is quite an old thing. Of course, there are newer critics who have been critical of either philosophy in total or some bits of philosophy. Quite often, the more metaphysical bits of philosophy have been the targets of doubt. So, that's just to motivate us into asking what to do. So there's a twofold problem here with philosophy. There's the problem of progress. So is there genuine progress in philosophy instead of mere change? So that's an important distinction to make, because someone might say, well, the theories that we have today are not the same as we had, say, 50 years ago. But maybe that's just change, maybe that's not progress. They might not be answering the same questions in any better sort of way. So is there genuine progress? And then the problem of usefulness, which especially the people coming from the sciences criticize, probably philosophy of, is whether it can be used for something instead of being obsolete or just clearly useless. So, what is the goal of philosophy is then good to ask, because depending on what the goal of philosophy is taken to be, it will color the way we approach this question. So, there are a couple of possibilities. One, maybe the goal of philosophy is something like edification. So it's more akin to art or poetry. It's sort of this high-minded cultural discussion or what have you. Or maybe it is something like clarification. So then philosophy tries to figure things out. Philosophy then is a mode of inquiry. And questions of this sort have been asked in more contemporary times by a lot of people, but at least from Lovejoy's lecture in 1917, you already find questions of this sort. So, we'll look at philosophy as inquiry. We take that if someone wants to do philosophy as edification, that's all fine and good, but we're not looking at that bit of it. And we are thus not looking at what would be to make progress in that. We are looking at what it would be make progress in philosophy as inquiry. So we are looking at philosophy that tries to figure things out. So presumably there's a way that things are, and philosophers try to seek out how things are through some non-arbitrary means. And if this is the case indeed, then we would expect to see a trend towards consensus. If we have some ways of looking at these things that are reliable enough, then one would think that if things indeed are in some way, then sooner or later we would start reaching something like a consensus. But as has been already repeatedly pointed out here in this conference from the Phil papers thing that Bourget and Chalmers did, almost the only bit of consensus is that there is no consensus. So, useful progress in philosophy. So, what the useful bit here does is, even if there was some progress in philosophical inquiry, it has to be useful for some purpose. Otherwise, it's quite idle. Or you can spot a slide that I've written when there's a fancy word like OTOs. So such usefulness should in some sense be related to making correct solutions to problems for some value of correct. So there are two types of possible progress. There are useful solutions. We solve some problem in a way that we say a way forward, way of using that solution for something, or then we can do useful theoretical developments. So, theoretical progress. A general framework is useful only if, one, it can be used for something, and that can be used for something only if, two, it gives information about its target. So, let us start putting some bones around this bit. So, what are the requirements for useful progress then? One might ask, and we indeed have asked. So, it must be to be useful, it has to be useful for something. And that means theories, models, conclusions, etc. are connected to something in an evaluable way. We call these kinds of things applicable theories, models, and conclusions, and so on. So, and there can of course be competing claims about any given subject, and they can also be applicable. To take an analogous example from sciences, there are competing scientific theories that can be used to do good scientific work. So, we need a non-arbitrary way of choosing among such claims, and this is done through justification. So, what will follow is is far better formulated in a paper we published a couple of years ago in the European Journal for Philosophy of Science called Epistemological Scientism and the Scientific Meta-Method. The QR code might work, and you can get the paper through that way, or just remember enough of the bits of the title or our names and you will find it. It's an open access paper. So, in the paper we give a couple of theses. So, the first of these we call the evaluability thesis. So, in short, for there to be a difference between something being justified and unjustified, justifications must be evaluable. So, we want to be able to say when something is justified or not, which means that its justification needs to be evaluable. And therefore, these justifications cannot be purely arbitrary or entirely unspecific. So there has to be a certain amount of specificity in our justifications, because otherwise it's impossible to evaluate them. And without being able to evaluate justifications, it's hard to give a distinction between something being justified and unjustified, at least on a practical level. So these give rise to some sub-theses. So 1.1, a presentation thesis. Justification must be intersubjectively evaluable through some means of presentation. So if we have a justification, it's not enough that we feel like we have one, we need to be able to share it with others. And it's hard to show, at least to others, if not to ourselves, how something is justified if I cannot present it in any kind of way. And therefore, if a claim is said to be self-justifying in some sense, it doesn't do any justificatory work. So there's of course more. 1.2, structure thesis. Justifications need to have a structure. So a justification always consists of three parts: reasons, a justification relation, and a conclusion. Justify is done with reasons through a justification relation to a conclusion. So, to state it, there are reasons, they might be, for instance, premises, and there are justification relations which might be something like rules of inference. And then there's the conclusion drawn from these. And if we don't have this kind of a structure, then it's impossible in some sense to say that we have justified something, and in those kinds of situations we could use the same justification to try to justify anything. And the justification relation is just the demand that we show how the claim follows from the initial claims, and in a way that's evaluable and of course, as per the earlier thesis, intersubjectively shared or shareable. And even more, conditionality. Every conclusion is only conditionally justified with respect to its reasons and justification relations. So, given the structure, there are things in the structure only insofar as those are accepted should the justification be accepted. And if for some reason one of those starts to lack warrant, then the justification starts to lack warrant. So, all claims are conditionally justified, and one can evaluate a given claim when a given claim is justified only if there are some specified premises and justification relations. So, some premises and justification relations must always be assumed, and consequently justification is only conditional on those assumptions. And circular justifications are only justified on the condition that the conclusion is already given as a premise, but this amounts to no added justification, of course, because we have already assumed the thing. So we have to do some other bit of justifying if we want that to be better justified. So there are some implications here for this conditionality thesis. Since all justification is conditional, one cannot exclude the possibility that any given justification can turn out to be flawed. So this is an outright admission of fallibility, which I think most people will surely agree that all our epistemic activities are fallible. And one can always ask how the premises or the justification relation themselves are justified, not just ask about the success of this one particular instance, but one can always sort of ask for further justifications of the grounds of the justification, let's call it that. So, and one might worry whether there's now a regression where nothing is really ever justified. But this is only a problem if one seeks an unconditional, absolute justification that does not rely on any initial assumptions. But it's very hard to see how one could have one of those. And such justifications further cannot be evaluated. If there are no initial assumptions, how do we evaluate whether or not we can draw any conclusions from that? And therefore, anything like that would result in matters arbitrary and quite epistemically worthless. And, of course, there's even more. Do not hold your breaths. This will take a bit. There's an applicability thesis. So these things that we try to justify, they have to be applicable. So there should be a difference between a justification being applicable and not applicable to some case. Its connection to that case needs to be evaluable. So it's not enough to have something justified if we cannot use it for anything. So this is where we start to get closer to the usefulness bit asked for in the beginning. And since these justifications are conditional, their applicability depends on how they are related to their targets. Therefore, we need to be able to evaluate how the system relates to its targets. So we need to have some way of saying that what we are doing is about something. So, specification thesis. There are subtheses. There are always subtheses. For justification to be applicable, there must be specified incompatible alternatives for its justified conclusions and initial reasons. So that's quite a mouthful, but what in essence we are saying, if we want to know whether a given claim applies somewhere, we also need to be able to assess how it would not apply. So there need to be contrasts that are being made. And then triviality thesis. A justification should not be trivial in the sense that it either cannot justify any conclusions or it can justify contradictory conclusions. So if something applies to everything, is always true, then it says nothing about anything. Because all possible conclusions can be drawn from it. Therefore, there must be a distinction between when something applies to a target and when it does not. And to continue on the same point, suppose that the same reasons and justification relations could justify incompatible conclusions. In that case, the conclusions are not applicable, or at least their justification does not provide any support for the conclusions being applicable. And thus, a justification must always be able to distinguish justified and unjustified conclusions. And here the problem are not the contradictions themselves, but the fact that they render the conclusions inapplicable. And then a practice thesis. For justification to be applicable in practice, its interpretation must be such that it is not trivial. So here we are not demanding that one proves some higher consistency as such, because that would mean that we would think that arithmetics, for instance, is not applicable, but of course it is. So here the idea is, as long as we do not encounter the contradiction in question or the incompleteness in question, it doesn't really matter. So, as stated more sort of grandiosely, the critical point is that the interpretation of the justification does not allow drawing incompatible conclusions. Not that it wouldn't be possible in some situation to do that, but it does not, when in the context we are using it, it doesn't allow for drawing incompatible conclusions. And what is an interpretation? What conclusions one takes to follow from which reasons and justification relations. And if the interpretation of a justification is not trivial, then the justification can be applied in practice. And there's plus discussion. Yeah, good. I was already a bit worried. Yeah. So, epistemic difference. For one justification to be epistemically superior to another, its superiority must be justified. So we, of course, want to sometimes compare different claims to each other. And therefore, we wish to see when there are differences in their justifications. So one cannot just claim that it is so. It must be independently justified that one is epistemically better than the other or superior to the other one. And this comes close to what Laura Snellman was saying yesterday about comparing worldviews. And you will see soon how. Because there's a sharing thesis. So a justification can be epistemically superior only if the justification for its superiority is shared. So that means we need to share our at least provisionally share our premises and justification relationships, and then we can start to do some comparison. And if we share some of those, at the very least, are able to share, then we can look at how things lie given the bits that we share. But this is no way, of course, to force anyone into agreement on these matters, because if someone doesn't agree with our starting point, then our spades are turned. When taken as an assumption, a justification does not need to be justified, because we always need to have some assumptions. The chain of justifications cannot be infinite. One always starts from reasons and justification relations of which one cannot say that they are better than others. So assumed justifications are not better than others, but they explain what has been accepted as epistemic success. So let's take a couple of examples. So empiricism, if one takes, here's one possibility of epistemic success criterion. X is epistemically superior to Y if X better fits empirical observations than Y. Now, one need not argue as such for this. This is only a criterion which can be assumed. Of course, someone else might not accept it, but that's sort of now we have a criterion of success which we can employ. Another possible criterion of success, not incompatible, is instrumental rationality. If one tries to do X and Y achieves X, then one should do Y. So here's another explication of success. And then there's the reliance thesis. Every justification either relies on some other justification or is taken as an assumption. Every justification ultimately depends on some assumptions or it is self-assumed. Yeah. So that just points out to in even larger print on the conditionality, on the fallibility of all our activities. So let us put these to practice, because these might seem sort of trivial. In some sense, they might seem that there's no application to them, which would be quite embarrassing for us. So let us look at the safety condition in analytic epistemology. So this is an attempt to answer get-here type cases. So when is something knowledge, and then, well, knowledge is justified, safe, true belief, or something like that under this assumption. So what's the safety thing? Safety is often cashed out in the following way. In all nearby worlds where S believes that P is not false. So such beliefs are safe and thus possibly knowledge. But what the heck are nearby worlds? That's the question. So that's the central question we wish to look at. So how can one specify a safety metric? So first, we cannot use realistic worlds. Those are far too complicated to work out. So they cannot be, that kind of a strategy cannot be applied in practice. And then we could look at the physical possibilities of worlds, but then of course we don't have a physics that consisted in this world. And so we cannot work those out. But one can of course assume that the world is just a certain way and the nearby worlds are in a certain way, but that's assuming the that's just assuming that one's belief is either safe or unsafe, and then one cannot see how to, in practice, solve any questions of whether I now have knowledge or I'm just lucky with my beliefs. So, yes, one of the theses being actually even referenced. So this is not a way to justify things. One could, of course, build a model and which has all these worlds in them, but then that model itself would have to be justified, and it's hard to see how to do that. So the safety condition might be used as an analysis of knowledge, but it doesn't seem to give us any way of seeing when we actually have knowledge in the actual world. So it doesn't seem to give us anything all that useful. So this would not be a case of useful progress in philosophy. But things are not so dark. There are successful cases. So let's take the contrafactual theory of causal explanation, or the interventionist theory of causal explanation. So this is not a metaphysical theory of causation. It doesn't aim to answer the metaphysical question of the nature of causation. It only tries to characterize it. And so, roughly, A causes B if and only if there were an intervention made on E, there would be some change in B. So that's a contrafactual claim about some intervention which would change things. And this is found with James Woodward and Julia Pearl have published on these things. So the causal claims under this view are clearly evaluable. They are presented publicly because you can always put that A, B, if only if schema. They have a clear structure, the same schema, and they have a target, whatever it is, whatever causal claim we are trying to establish, and they are non-trivial because it doesn't always happen that we find a causal relationship. And there was this, but we'll skip it over. It's not that interesting. So, conclusions. There are methodological constraints for philosophical inquiry if we wish to be able to make useful progress. And here's an unjustified claim at the moment. This presentation, the thesis in this presentation, is an example of work consistent with the thesis, and so are counterfactual theories of causation. So philosophical progress is at least possible. And these theses might seem trivial, but as we have seen, they do rule some things out and rule some things in. So they have non-trivial implications. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So any comments? Okay, there's Valdi is the closest now.
Yeah, thanks. Something that came up during the talk when I was thinking is that the focus on kind of applicability and then the kind of the consequences and so on of what predicted was it raises the question whether we are in a little bit of trouble with that. because it seems that often the consequences of philosophy are for non-philosophy. So, for instance, Feynman and all these scientists arguing that philosophy is wrong. Don't really realize that to point out that they're doing philosophy and doing it on the basis of philosophical tradition that someone taught them what science is all about. Not that science haven't contributed to that. So there's also a confusion about philosophy as a discipline and philosophy as a kind of thought and feeling keep, which also philosophers are engaged in. So I'm wondering if we kind of building here these criteria, applicability that we are not going to apply. This is kind of given that science picks up on ideas, then it will show itself to be good. Let's say that philosophy contributed to the development of the view of human, so this is the Declaration of Human Rights, and that's then been taken by politicians to change society and so on. Is that a problem? That we can't really evaluate the non-triviality of the consequence of philosophy until results have been almost implemented in other fields of society and science.
I think there's because there's of course all these things are in a quite modal tone of voice. So applicability is a modal concept, and therefore the fact that something has not been applied, of course, or has is not a mark against it. It's sort of trying to figure out if we want something to be sort of use, then it should be such that it can be applied. And then whether or not anyone actually applies it, well, that's a bit of a different question. But it's sort of the gatekeeping we are doing here, and this is pretty much very much gatekeeping, is trying to have a meta philosophy under which we take care ourselves of the fact that we do something that is applicable and therefore might be useful, and then whether or not it's picked up.
Thanks, and Lauri, please, very short comments.
Okay. I'd like to ask that what kind of theory are you building? Because are you building a kind of axiomatic epistemological logic style theory? Because you have this like justification relation, and you have some principles of actions that in so many ways resemble classical foundationalism, that you are kind of in this kind of structured justifications in order to apply get applicable knowledge and in order to kind of rule out this kind of permanent dissensus. Because exactly how is your theory of this structure is kind of some philosophical with statements or all these books.
So the attempt is to give a set of criteria that can be sort of easily enough followed in order to get what we set up as the goal to get useful progress. So I can see the comparison to foundationalism, but of course, as I point out in several points, this is all rather conditional. The first conditionality comes from whether or not you accept our aims for philosophy. If you don't, then of course we have no way to force anyone there. And even after that, all the bits were sort of explicitly conditional and fallibilist. So it's not. I see in which sense it might seem foundationalist, but it's not.
Thanks. Then Ron Crisley.
Thank you. I like the fact that you gave these examples of how you can apply the criteria and basically show that some justifications lacking for certain approaches, certain theories. But I wonder if there is a mismatch between the stringency that you would apply that you use when applying these criteria, and in the stringency in setting up the criteria themselves. So maybe I misunderstood, but in the practice thesis, I felt like maybe there was some hand waving going on there, saying, well, I'm going to acknowledge that you can never prove, you can in general prove consistency, but within the context, yeah, you can be pretty sure that you're consistent or not. I felt like you were being, it seemed like there was an appeal to some kind of informal notion, yeah, this is good enough, which is exactly the kind of thing you want to try to get rid of with, for instance, the staging condition. We can sort that out. We'll have a pretty good idea about what truths are what's true in nearby worlds. So do you think I'm being a little unfair, or do you think that there is a weakness there?
There might be a weakness there, but I think there's this one distinction here to be made, which is to take the safety thing. It's really sort of up for grabs how we populate the worlds unless we have a metric. But then, say, consistency of arithmetics thing, we just happen to be able to do arithmetics in a way that nobody finds problematic. So it, of course, will depend on what kind of inconsistencies might be possible. But there seems to be sort of a qualitative enough of a difference between those cases. But it's a good point to press us on.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's not on the thing.
Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
My question is this. So you have make a distinction, and it seems like between justified and unjustified, but at the same time, it seems like you kind of like can draw the distinction if you have some method, and if we disagree about the methods, then also we cannot agree on what is justified and unjustified. So I don't know if you have some considerations about what are the right methods to apply this model.
Yeah. We have a paper coming up on sort of good meta methods for building methods. We like doing lists. So yes, we have some ideas, but I think here it's not very hard for us to. We didn't want at this juncture to be too strict about that bit. So there is indeed if there are competing methods and we find no agreement, then as per the last thesis of shareability, it will be such that we will not be able to resolve our disagreements on which methods to use. But then hopefully we can find some common ground somewhere else and then start working from there, and maybe then resolve the difference or disagreements about which methods to use. So it's not an easy way necessarily of working things out, but that's, I think, sort of the best way that we have is try to have open discussions on these things and try to find common ground.
Thank you, Ilkka.